the group, so I'm here to entertain you for a few seconds before the panelists come up. My name is Casey Green. I'm with the Campus Computing Project. I will be the moderator for our session about big data. Everybody having a good time? Yes. Just, you know, the morning group was a much more animated, much more engaged audience. How many of you were here this morning? Wow, okay. What happened? Lunch? You're all disappointed that you're not leaving with Corning glass? Buy an iPhone, you'll get some Corning glass. So, all right, just in part for our panel members who are in the wings, I want to recalibrate the audience. If you were here this morning, you'll recall I asked how many of you were with different kinds of educational organizations. So again, we want to know who's in the audience and who's likely to be offended by some of the conversation this afternoon, particularly as we talk about data. How many of you have a full-time occupational identity in a college or university? All right. How many of you have a part-time identity in a college or university? Okay. How many of you are college faculty? Your primary role is instruction. How many of you are college or university administrators? How many of you are in K-12 as teachers, as administrators? How many of you are aspiring entrepreneurs hoping to find that one gem of insight, information, or data that will transform your market planning, product planning, and ultimately your life? How many of you came for the free lunch? With the morning group, I asked how many of you are here on institutional money. I won't ask that question this afternoon. Okay. Those of you that are mic'd, you can actually come on stage. That's okay. They won't bite. They were rather well behaved this morning. Wherever you'd like. Wherever you'd like. Excuse me for one moment. Be useful if I got my notes. Great. You know, this is really striking. This morning between sections, we couldn't keep it quiet in here. And now everybody is just kind of, you're all saving yourself for tonight, right? How many of you bought tickets for shows? How many of you received cancellation notices about your flights? How many of you dread going back to a colder climate someplace east of Las Vegas? Okay. We're almost all set to go. I'm going to start. We're almost there. Actually, by the time Ann gets here. So again, my name is Casey Green with the Campus Computing Project. As was the case with the two panels I moderated this morning, our panelists have degrees that most of us could only dream about. They have accomplishments that your spouses, parents, and others would ask why you haven't done that. So their bios are in the book. I'm not going to take time to go through all that, but very quickly to my left, your right, bad joke, it's geographic, it's not political. We have Dylan Arena, who is co-founder and chief learning scientist of Kidaptive. Next to Dylan is Rahim Rajan, who's a senior program officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Known familiarly to many of us as just the Gates Foundation, as opposed to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next to Rahim is Heather Hiles, who's the CEO of Pathbrite. And why are you so far away from the rest of the group? You can. Did you do something to offend Heather? Or did Heather do something to? It's never. Okay. Just checking. And Ann Duane, who's the chief business officer of Chegg. We'd like to welcome them all. How many of you know something about big data? How many of you think you know something about big data? I guess that's the. How many feel that big data is a good thing? Big data will be a good thing. How many of you have concerns about big data? How many of you like the reminders you get from Amazon that all the smart kids bought one book that you bought, and now somebody else who's smarter than you is buying something else, and you need to buy that? That's the way most of us were introduced to one application of big data. We talk a lot about big data. Let me just try to set the context. So we have this kind of coming of big data. One of the endemic questions about education, K-12 and higher ed is, why don't we use data effectively for feedback about learning, management, and operations? Too much of what we do in education seems to be still driven by opinion and epiphany. There is often a quest for consensus. Often the complaint is we don't have good or timely data even though we have reams of data. It seems to be that big data tech resources from the consumer and corporate market are eventually going to come into education. They're coming already. And actually this is from a piece, was in the New York Times a little over a year ago, 2 years ago. We're just getting underway. If you are excited or intimidated about the prospects of big data now, just wait. Because more and more of it is coming, and at least according to Gary King at Harvard's Data Institute, Institute for Quantitative Social Science, it's only just beginning, and it's beginning everywhere. The conundrum, I think, for many of us, however, is this. Sitting around a table, we're asking questions about things. We have lots of information technology, we just don't have any useful information. None of you have had that experience, is that right? What happened to the audience from this morning? If you find those folks, send them back. We also know that higher education, I can't speak to K-12, but these are 3 national surveys I've run in the last 2 years, almost 1,000 presidents, 1,100 provosts, 500 some odd CFOs. Actually, I could add a column on here for CIOs as well. Overwhelmingly, we have data to suggest that we don't use data. These are the percentages of folks in these various titles who say, my institution does not do a good job of using data for decision making. And also to help frame the conversation, I'd like to pay homage to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, scholar, statesman, ambassador, and senator. This is Professor Moynihan in 1971, during his stint as a cabinet secretary, shortly after some years after the historic Coleman Report, Progress in Educational Attainment, which was launched as part of an effort to say, what can we do better? They had, at the time, massive amounts of data. And then this is sort of the honest broker role. This is Moynihan saying in congressional testimony, things in education are far more complex than we thought. The simple input-output relationships, which we naively, no doubt, honestly assume to obtain on examination, don't hold up. In other words, education is a black box, even if you have multivariate data to help you navigate that. A quick personal story before we go to the panel to put this in context. 30 years ago, I was involved in what were big data projects before big data. In a prior life, I was the operating officer of UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute. Some of you may know that work associated with the name of Sandy Aston. We surveyed 300,000 college students a year. We did trend data over decades, years and decades. We did longitudinal follow-up surveys. We did big data, tracking students over time, tracking their majors, tracking their initial aspirations as opposed to eventual outcomes, how much money campuses spent on students, and all kinds of other stuff. In 1980, at the beginning of the demographic decline that was supposed to decimate higher education, a huge fall off in the size of the high school graduating class, I began doing some work with some institutions that all of a sudden felt, yes, we should pay attention to retention and keeping students as opposed to just recruiting them. Because none of the administrative information systems at the time could give you a cohort flow, how many students entered in a particular year, graduated 5 or 6 years later, we actually took the data files from several institutions, merged them, did a 6-year analysis, cohort flow, multivariate analysis, not only just to get the top level numbers, but to get very significant data about who succeeded, who did well, what was the migration of students in and out of majors, and some other stuff. And we went to one of the institutions that participated in this project for a meeting with their president and their provost. And we said, we have some really good news. We have great data for you. We have tremendous insights in terms of what we know about your students over time, who does well academically, who stays in the majors they intended, who views their college experience as successful, who graduates in 4 years, 5 years, and 6 years. All the stuff that would seem to be grist for the mill. The problem was that this was a Catholic institution. As it turned out, the students who did best, had the highest GPAs and retention rates, were Jewish students. So there wasn't an immediate lever there that the campus could pull in terms of changing its mission. You have to look for some other stuff. It's a case study, I think, in terms of the issue of numbers versus nuance. as we have this conversation about big data. So with that, I'm going to turn initially to Rahim. Gates Foundation has been spending a lot of time and a lot of effort surveying the landscape of data, big data. What are we doing well? What do we need to do better? What has the Gates Foundation learned about this as we look at both at education and particularly higher ed?
That's a great question, Casey. I think what we're learning is that it's still early. It's one of the threads that's been running through today's conversation. The way in which these systems and technologies are being deployed to understand problems around retention, student success, learning, it's still very early. And part of that is a result of the maturity of the solutions, as well as the practice, the real technical skills required to aggregate the data, to mine the data. Many colleges and universities are struggling. They don't have that capacity. But I think what's really important is that over the course of 2013, a lot of data was created. You can see that with the explosion of the MOOCs. And institutions are beginning to realize that they are constrained by a variety of different pressures. If they're going to increase their performance, if they're going to increase outcomes for their students, they have to understand at a very granular level what's working and what's not working. And you can't do that without measurement and analysis.
So Rahim, you used the word capacity.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's two buckets in the conversation about capacity. One is an enabling technology infrastructure, and one are the human factors and resources. The stuff that the technology allows us to do and the stuff that the people use once they get it. Which is the bigger challenge? Is the issue about big data in education and higher ed one of a technology coming from corporate and consumer markets? Or is it one about the people, faculty, administrators, others, in terms of training, understanding, utilization, changing a culture for data?
So I have my opinions on this.
Well,
I'd say it's the latter.
Okay.
I would say that, in terms of where the consumer industry is with big data, they're very far advanced of how those technologies are being deployed in education. And when you think about why that's not happening in education, it's not that it's not happening, it's happening in isolated pockets. There are institutions out there that are doing a bang-up job of taking that data, mining that data, warehousing the data, analyzing the data, but they are the exception, they're the rarity. And I think that the critical gating factor here is a capacity, a human capacity issue.
Can we crowdsource that one, if we will, to the audience? How many of you think the big data challenge is one of technology? We got to buy the tools. How many of you believe it's one of people? We've got to train the folks. And leadership, the will to use the data as opposed to deal with opinion and epiphany. Great. And I want to turn to the issue of transactional data. So we've heard from the earlier conversations today about MOOCs. They're checking every keystroke and eyeball movement. Yep. You can do that with the experience in an LMS. You can also do that with products. And we know, for example, that Amazon, according to a number of reports, is looking at the interaction between reader and screen on romance novels and feeding that information back to the various publishing houses in terms of character development and plot line. We know that some of the educational publishers are talking about that same opportunity as well. Time on task, time on screen, the underlining, all of the individual transactional data and aggregating it up. What are the opportunities there and what are the limits of this very micro transactional data?
Right. So I think that the first is actually the data itself being available, because the first way to solve a problem is to identify it, right? And if you want to improve something, measure it. And though the statistics are alarming, right, it's good to know them. Chegg did a survey of thousands of recent graduates about 6 months after graduation. And over 50% of them, they were from 2-year and 4-year institutions, said if they could do it all over again, they'd pick a different school or a different major. So the problem was they hadn't asked the right questions, or the important criteria was not available to them. So there's value just in the data. And we're getting better about that as an ecosystem. The second is you asked about transactional data. And so that's also very valuable. So on the Chegg side, we can talk about saving almost $500 million in that students saved on materials that they got, and a lot of that's powered by big data, getting them the right stuff at the right time. And we have about 500,000 digital subscribers to supplemental materials that help students when they're stuck, when they're doing calculus at 2 a.m. and the tutoring center is closed. And the students are self-reporting that about 91% of them got better grades because they had the ability to master concepts on their own time with the assistance of either an expert, an online expert, or with the step-by-step solutions. But what's more interesting than the data or the transactions is the relationships. And the relational data is what will enable students to discover all the different options for connecting to people, to resources, to courses, to schools, to learning in the format that will be most helpful for them. And that's just tremendously important because not only can you start discovering good stuff for you, but you can start exploring what are the possible outcomes for me, and then what are the paths to get there. And again, that exploration is, really exciting. So, but therein, there's a limitation. And the danger is that for students, data should not be their destiny. And sometimes what can happen is because of your pattern, you will start getting more of certain stuff. So you start learning, your choices are actually diminished, when really the point should be, how do we help people make more informed choices, right? And that's where I worry that if we're not careful, we can be so worried about being predictive that we're actually not helpful or empowering to help people make better decisions about how they're going to invest in their time and money in themselves to get the outcomes that they would like.
Okay, let's go to the other side of the coin. We've been talking about data, numbers. Heather, your company does e-portfolios for corporations, for schools, and for colleges. Some might argue, you might position the company, say, we are the personalized oasis in a world of high tech. We are high touch because we let people bring the full experience as opposed to a scale, a number, a code into this environment. Sort of navigate us through, how many of you are familiar with e-portfolios? All right, so one, take us quickly into the world of e-portfolios.
Sure.
And two, how does one complement, supplement, or supplant? I mean, is there a point of détente between the quantitative and the qualitative, or is there one of an added value gestalt?
Yeah, there's a holistic piece to this. And first of all, at its very basic essence, an e-portfolio is a mechanism for the learner online to document and reflect on what they're learning. That's the core technology of ePortfolio learning. That process produces lots of magical results in terms of improved critical thinking skills, metacognition, owning of your own learning process. And so what we have done with a Web 2.0 ePortfolio is made a system whereby learners of all ages can have ownership and really reflect on what they're learning and achieving.
I'm sorry, when you say Web 2.0, you're talking about user-generated content.
Digital, any sort of digital evidence of what I've learned or achieved in the classroom, online, in my job, in the community, at this conversation.
But what's important is,
all be pulled together.
teacher's not putting it in, I'm putting it in. I'm building my portfolio.
You are, at the
Okay.
core learner experience. We now have Pathbrite for educators where people can teach courses by building templates of portfolios. But that's the kind of that's the development of the first Web 2.0 ePortfolio platform.
All right, so does it complement, supplants?
It complements. What it does is it enables you to aggregate summative data like electronic test scores, secure official transcripts, and pull those artifacts of what I've learned and achieved and couple that with my reflection. So for example, I may have a transcript from business school says I earned a B in microeconomics. Well, you might just say, well, that was Heather's worst grade. She is not that sharp at microeconomics. But if you read my reflection saying I didn't have calculus going in and I had to teach myself calculus in order to pass the class, I'm proudest of that grade. And you may learn something different about me, that I'm hardworking, I'm resourceful, et cetera.
So sorry, how many of you have had calculus? Just to anchor that? Okay.
See? So I was at a deficit and a handicap going into business school, and this was before Khan Academy or anything else. So I had to really work to learn this online. No MOOC was made available to me. So my point being that you can, when you look at the holistic representation of what's meaningful to me, how I can communicate my achievements holistically, there is absolutely a role for any kind of empirical, quantitative data substantiating what I've done and learned, but it's complemented with my reflections. And if you look at data, the reflections, how I talk about what I'm learning, highly predictive. highly accurate, but unstructured data is a gold mine of very, very valuable data that can help me with future success.
In a world of highly quantified big data,
Yes.
how do I pull the metadata out of my unstructured personal reflections
Yeah.
that researchers at Acme University or Acme Community College can say, wait, I've got transcript data,
Yeah.
I've got midterm data, I've got other kinds of demographic data about students, and then I've got this unstructured data that looks like it's kind of interesting, but I want to know that, how do I put that into the gumbo in terms of understanding the aggregate student experience?
Well, that's very important. That's where we come into play. So first of all, the first challenge is to find a vehicle where you can pull all of this stuff into one place. And that's the core of what a portfolio interface does. The second part of the back end of it is having, again, a relational graph database like Chegg, like LinkedIn, like Google has, where we can look at any 2 or 3 or a handful of different learning artifacts and build relationships between them. You can run learning algorithms on those. And I can even define for myself a dashboard of what I want to track about my own progress and development. So I may say that pattern recognition, public speaking, these are certain skills I want to track my own development progress on, and then I can define for myself and track my own progress. So the interpretation of the data and the building of dashboards that mean something to teachers as well as students is exactly where we are right now.
So Dylan, your bio says you're a cognitive scientist, is that right?
Yes.
You have real skills, unlike many of us.
Marketable skills.
We've had, pardon?
I said marketable skills.
Marketable skills, as opposed to real. Those are two different, all right, thank you. For 30 plus years, we have talked about the potential of gaming as a tool in education. It speaks to a learning experience. It speaks to an interactive experience. It speaks to a personalized experience. It speaks to also the potential for highly personalized transactional data as well, as another part of the gumbo. You know, what's the real power and potential of gaming? I mean, how real is it? And particularly when we see the kind of investments that come in the commercial and the corporate sector for the consumer market, what's it going to take to bring that technology and that investment into the education at a parallel level?
There are a couple of features of games that make them particularly suited to gathering the kinds of transactional data that might prove interesting. The first is that games are tests. All games are just tests. Can you make Mario jump? Can you make Mario jump to stomp on a mushroom? Can you make him jump to avoid a flying Koopa, etc.? Which means that as a learner plays a game, what's really happening is continuous embedded assessment. Whether you tap into that is another question, but so the assessment is already built in. The games have that for free.
So there's a kind of hidden adaptive learning that's going on.
Yes.
Whether the user sees it or not.
Which is intrinsic to a well-designed game.
Where I'm playing Witchcraft or Worlds of War or Barbie or unicorns or whatever else it might be.
Yeah.
Okay.
The second is that games are simulations, just intrinsically, which means that they can allow learners to explore contexts that are hard to really get at in real life, like a frictionless environment, or conservation of momentum. The game Portal is a puzzle game that leverages that particular sort of neat physical quirk that you can never experience in real life to have a really compelling sort of game loop. And the third is that if a game is well designed, it's engaging, not in the sense of just being like whiz-bang flashy, but in the sense of creating a setting that I care to participate in and presenting me with challenges that I care to solve, which means that it can leverage our best efforts. It's more at its best than a digital worksheet because it's not some sort of desultory task. It's something that I'm fired up about putting my time and energy into. A more recent development is that now, with mobile being as pervasive as it is, we can use games to bridge formal and informal environments, which gives us an opportunity to see how learners respond and think across settings, and to connect learning for the learners from formal settings to informal settings. So bring school out of the classroom, bring real life into the classroom.
So I'm wondering about that because we have this ongoing conversation about STEM and science as being the gateway to lots of different opportunities. I have a hard time visualizing what a gamified version of calculus might be, or linear algebra. Can you walk me through that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You could do it badly. by
Well, I think a
giving-
lot of stuff is done badly.
Yes,
we
yeah,
want to
yeah.
do it right.
Okay, so-
how many of you want to do it badly?
A great
so the-
example is not simply to gamify the kinds of procedural fluency kind of tasks and rote memorization that you would get in a traditional skill and drill approach.
Yeah.
There's an example, I forget where the research was done, but it was a high-level fluid mechanics class. And the way the professor taught the class wasn't simply to introduce this really complicated calculus-laden material. It was to present the learners, the students in the class, with the challenge of building a car that would complete a race around a racetrack in a certain amount of time. The hitch was they couldn't be in the car. The car was a virtual car, and they had to program AI to make all the right choices to drive the car around the race. So they had to really understand all of the elements of sort of a graduate level mechanical engineering, couple that with the basics of AI, at least enough AI to get an agent to drive a car around a racetrack. And they didn't know what the racetrack was. The racetracks were randomly generated. So over the course of this semester, the students in this high-level ME class had to grapple with the sort of all of the content that had been taught in the class in previous years, but they did so in a context that, number one, was concrete. So it made sense to them. It was directly applicable to a real setting. You know, it was a virtual setting, but it was like, I understand how this formula translates into the way a car behaves on the road. It was fun, and not just sort of in a wee kind of way, but it was like, I'm invested. I'm creating something, an artifact that is going to perform, and that performance is a reflection of my learning. And the outcomes from that class showed that these kids mastered the basic sort of dry textbooky material as well as they had in previous years, but their motivation to continue with high-level ME was much, much higher than it had been in previous years.
So I'm thinking about the current conversation about privacy. You've each made, and others earlier today have made compelling comments about the value of data and analytics and other kinds of things in terms of feedback to users, feedback to faculty, feedback to administrators, institutions. I take the transactional data from an interactive textbook. I take the transactional data, the keystroke data from a game that I'm involved with. I take my demographic data that comes with my application to a school or a college, some other assessment in things that may be my career inventory or other kinds of things. I throw it into the gumbo. Do I have reason to be concerned about this in terms of privacy issues? Higher education has lots of rules about FERPA. We go back to the Buckley Act that prevented institution faculty members from putting social security numbers and grades on the wall that have since been expanded. All kinds of things in this. You know, we talk about the aggregate benefits. What about the risk to individuals? I mean, am I at risk potentially that with all this big data stuff about me, you know, much the same way that a casual and careless handwritten note from my fourth grade teacher can follow me through the rest of my life, and actually has, but that's a different story. Anybody on this in terms of, Heather?
Yeah, I think privacy is a huge issue. One of the things that we really evangelize at Pathbrite and believe deeply is that people should be in ownership of their own content. And one of the muscles we try to build with learners as early as possible is the notion that you should have a safe and private place for all of your content, to curate it, to reflect on it and benefit from it. But you should be very, very conscious about when you share any of your content with others. So there's kind of a gate that you go through from having a private account with all your portfolio and your library of content to when you share it with a teacher or a professor. You go through into a course environment, and you're being reminded that you are now making this available to a public audience. Or if you're going to share a portfolio to your social graph, as a college student would to LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, well, now you're sharing it with the digital universe. So we try to remind people that the majority of your content should be held by you.
But Heather, you're talking about individuals trying to take control, much like the privacy controls on my
build that
Facebook
muscle,
account.
yes.
I'm thinking about the fact is that my institution's got a lot of stuff on me.
Sure they
it's
do.
you know, we've recommended digital textbooks. Somebody's scraping, not just what I'm doing, but everybody else. My mechanical engineering class has got a gaming for something that's coming into, or a simulation from microeconomics. The Gates Foundation is supporting, hypothetically, or perhaps actually supporting a project with a couple of pilot institutes. Let's scrape it all together and throw it into the gumbo. What are we learning? You know, what privacy issues should we be concerned about at the institutional level? Heather talked about individuals learning to manage privacy. What do institutions have to understand?
I think one of the key dangers is one that Anne mentioned, which is the narrowing of opportunities. Recently, there have been efforts in higher education to help students graduate on time by doing things like looking at their declared major. Your declared major is engineering. You're a junior. You haven't taken any engineering courses. You should take some. And at first blush, that seems completely reasonable, you know? But that can quickly move into a recommendation system that becomes a self-tightening knot.
Actually, there's an extension of that, because if you use an Amazon model, not only should you take it, there's 4 seats left in the intro course. We're selling them because there's 16 people that want them. But go ahead.
So if I come in with a set of interests and skills, and the system does a fairly good job of assessing that and saying, hey, 70% of kids like you ended up majoring in creative writing, I might say, hey, that sounds good, I'll do it. Now it's a little bit higher. The next kid that comes in, hey, 80% of kids like you ended up in creative writing. And
But what
I say,
about the risk of channeling? I mean, we have lots of
That's the
history
risk
in
I'm talking
institutions doing exactly that kind of channeling, either on the basis of transcript data or the activities of individual teachers, saying, you can never be X because.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, don't we have as much of a
about.
risk on that in
Right.
terms of capricious judgments of individuals as opposed to inappropriate use of data, Raheem?
You know, I would say that with any kind of revolution in technology, and we're going through a societal revolution, right? I mean, you go to the exhibit hall and there's all this wearable tech, watches that, you know, talk to you, or things that monitor your heart rate.
Yeah.
Like we're going through this explosion of data that's aimed around cataloging our lives. And you know, I would say that with any kind of explosion of new technologies, there's going to be a regulatory, a policy, kind of a privacy conversation. Those conversations are the right conversations. But what I would say is that, you know, we have to also go back to first principles and think about why are some of these companies or some of these organizations interested in aggregating and mining that data. And I would say that really often the use case is not constricting, you know, futures or narrowing futures. It's actually trying to lift up people who have not been well served by the existing system. And helping institutions to be much more targeted and much more focused about serving their students better rather than worse. And so that's kind of the orientation where I come from. I think a lot of these technologies are early, but they will be enablers. They will help us to fulfill the promise of education.
All right, so let's look 24, 36 months forward. Can we stipulate that as a group, the panel would say we're still early in this process? Is that okay? Crowdsourcing the question, the bigger issue was not the enabling technology, but the human factors. If we will stipulate that big data should be a good thing for education, K-12 and higher ed, what are the 3 top priorities for the next 24 to 36 months? If I'm a faculty member, if I'm a college president or a provost, if I'm a K-12 principal or a school district superintendent, in terms of going towards big data. Dylan, let me start with you.
I would say, this might be a little bit idiosyncratic, but we should de-emphasize calculus as the capstone course for K-12 and move towards a statistics or data analysis trajectory. Because, I mean, Heather ran into difficulty not having calc, but very few of us get out into the world and need calculus in our everyday lives.
Actually, let's test that. I asked how many of you had had calculus. Put your hands up. How many of you remember anything about calculus? Well, half the hands stayed up. How many of you used calculus in the last 24 hours? Thank you. Okay. Heather, I didn't take calculus either. I met you, so
I now have
go.
taken calculus.
So keep going. I'm sorry. We just need to go ahead.
So the idea would be to bring up a generation of students who had much more comfort thinking about data, probability, statistics, widen the pool of talent for filling these roles that we need filled to manage the data.
Raheem, what do we do for the next 24 to 36 months?
I would say, and I'll just throw out the institutional hat. I think that the real challenge will be on institutions to raise up very defined efforts with a demonstrable ROI of how big data help their institutions serve their students better. And I think when we have those clear examples that illustrate the potential of these practices and technologies, we will be having a different conversation.
Heather?
Yeah, I'm going to add on what Raheem is saying because I totally agree, which is that institutions will get better at using data to have better learning outcomes for their students and to be able to show a stronger return on the investments, especially as it pertains to being prepared and placed into the world of work from higher education. And then from the individual experience, the learner experience, we're just going to personalize the data so that I have connection with the data I'm generating, and I benefit and have better future success because I have an understanding and connection with the data that I'm creating that's being analyzed for me.
And 24 to 36 months?
I'd say focus on what are the questions we should be asking, because we will be able to get the answers, but we can waste a lot of time and effort by doing that. And then I think the other is that don't fall into the trap that big data has to have a big price tag. Code for America has proven, if you're familiar with that organization, they take recent college graduates and they ask them to code against big problems with, say, a city government or something. And it's amazing what a few developers with a lot of innovation and grit can come up with to actually extract tremendous insights and value without a lot of cost.
Great. All right, so we have a little bit of time to go to audience questions.
Great. Thanks, Casey. Thank you all.
Thank
Any
you.
questions? There's got to be questions on data. Here we go,
All
right here.
And as before with my sessions at least, please identify yourself by name and organization so we can make inappropriate inferences as you ask a question.
Fantastic. With that threat, my name is Raj Valley. I'm CEO of Tapter. I'll be talking here as well in the next whatever time. But I have one question. I'm always intrigued by, the resourcefulness or the success of anything. Now we're talking big data. Do we have proof that it actually works? And why do we believe that this is actually going to be successful?
Oh, you want evidence?
Well, I think the whole purpose of doing something
Evidence?
new is the fact that it's going to work.
Well, I will.
Evidence that big data works.
Well, I mean, big data in general, I won't speak to evidence of that per se, but what I will say is that there are longitudinal studies of Eportfolios as a technology that have proven, 10-year long studies that have proven improved critical thinking skills, writing proficiencies, program completion by the usage of Eportfolios in higher ed. And so that was, for us, meaningful enough, studies to build on a foundation of that technology and to extend it. And so the usage of that learning data, we think we can even enhance the past former outcomes.
Raheem?
Just a few examples. A lot of institutions are using predictive analytics to begin to be able to better understand their incoming freshmen and the needs of those freshmen. Another use case is in the MOOCs. A lot of researchers are actually sifting through millions of data points that have been generated from just one course to actually understand where were learners dropping off, what were learners doing, what were learners understanding, engagement kind of in the course. So I think that there are demonstrable cases now where people are sifting through this data and coming up with some really important insights about learning and about student success.
Dylan? Evidence?
There are tons of examples of evidence from other industries. As we said opening the panel, this is an area in which other consumer technology industries are much farther ahead than we are in education. At my company, Kidaptive, we have a team of technologists who have done this stuff in other contexts and shown great value. In the world of gaming, it's absolutely required that you be instrumenting your game so that you can understand where the kill zones are, what the economy is like, etc.
Where the happy zones are.
Where the happy zones are too. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, if we may. Please, you are?
Brendan Flores, Poliera. I just had a question because I thought it was really interesting when you polled the audience that everybody seemed to acknowledge that it was people that were really the constraint in making the changes.
Actually, they were saying other people, not themselves.
Yeah, right.
Of course, be very clear.
So I really wanted to hear from the panel what you guys view are the constraints that are causing people to act in this way. Is it policy? Is it vested interests, dirty, deep, dark secrets that people don't talk about very often? What are those things?
Oh, this is Las Vegas. There are no secrets.
I would say it's a pragmatic thing. I'd say it's the lure of industry. The data scientists that are out there, they have their pick of the kinds of problems that they can go after. Healthcare is a big one, technology, IT, et cetera. So I think, there is a new generation of data scientists that are really interested in solving some of these social problems like education. And hopefully, the problems in education will attract some of the smartest minds in those fields, and we can make some progress.
But I also think it's fair to say, at least with higher education, there is a culture on some campuses, or a pretense of culture of consensus. And consensus is sometimes not always the advocate for evidence. You know, we should do this, we can do this, we must do this. Where's the evidence? Well, that really doesn't matter, or we don't have it. And it's that consensual culture, or one of epiphany and opinion, that sometimes overwhelms the quest for evidence, or the absence of evidence, I think applies. And you look like you want in on this.
Oh, well, too, the culture of the rewards of innovation are eclipsed by the penalties of failure. And then I think we do have an alignment of incentives problem, right? The voice of the student is not as articulate as it should be in higher education. So, you know, if you think about, if you will go through all the constituencies in higher ed, you know, faculty often think about tenure, they think about publishing, they think about research, right? And not in all cases, but that is an important part of their career, right? In many cases, especially if they're not adjuncts. And, you know, many colleges and universities talk about graduation rate. That's not necessarily employment, right? So that's it, and not to say it's bad, but if we don't have the balanced scorecard, right, the student ends up losing.
Yeah, I think the other part also, there's a long history of using data as a weapon, not as a resource. And it's used as part of a big stick that says what you did wrong, as opposed to what you can do better and how you connect the dots. And that one is a big cultural issue that applies for many. I think we have time for one last
more.
question.
Here we go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You are?
Good afternoon. Shirley Hurt from Ann Arbor, Michigan. My background is K through 12, actually English secondary ed with an MBA, so I'm an anomaly. I didn't realize that I was going to have this wonderful panel discussion, but I would particularly like to thank the Gates Foundation for all of the work that they are doing in public education and breaking down some of the barriers. I have had the honor of meeting and visiting one-on-one with Professor Robert Bain, who is very involved with the Big History Project, which contains much of the big data. And the other part that's happening in this particular university is the teaching works process. There are lots of universities that are beginning to look at the processes of learning, which my husband has been involved in with Six Sigma and General Electric, and he's been trying to work with public education. And the stumbling block seems to be the leadership over and over and over again, and it's a fear more than anything else.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
My thanks to all of you. My thanks to the panel, Dylan, Raheem, Heather, Ann.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Kate.